The moment Henrietta Dalton walked into the harvest supper and saw every single person at the long oak tables scoot an inch or two away from the man sitting alone at the end of the third row, she felt something shift inside her chest like a door swinging open on a rusty hinge. The year was 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat right on the edge of everything, the edge of the cattle trail, the edge of civilization, and the edge of the kind of wild that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. It was the sort of town that had sprung up fast and loud, full of cattle drivers and merchants and women who kept their chins high and their opinions higher. The harvest supper was the one event that pulled everyone together under the same lantern light, where the smell of roasted corn and warm bread made even the roughest men remember they had once been boys who'd sat at their mothers' tables. Henrietta had only been in Caldwell for 6 weeks. She had come west from Missouri after her father passed, leaving behind a farm that had been swallowed by debt and a house that held more grief than she could carry alone. She was 24 years old, capable, and not particularly inclined to let anyone make her feel small. She had taken a position keeping the books for Mr. Amos Gentry at the dry goods store, and she had quietly made herself useful enough that nobody thought much about the fact that a woman was handling the ledgers. She carried a small basket with a loaf of bread she had baked that morning, and she wore her best dress, which was a deep brown calico with cream-colored buttons she had polished with a cloth before leaving the boarding house. Her dark hair was pinned up sensibly, and her eyes, which were the color of river water in autumn, not quite green, not quite gray, swept the long room with the practiced calm of a woman who had learned early that the best way to understand a situation was to look at it plainly before making any decisions. She saw the tables filling up, the children darting between legs, the women trading recipes and gossip with equal enthusiasm. She saw the men in their good shirts, the ones they only pulled out for church and suppers like this, trying their best to look like they weren't completely uncomfortable being indoors. She saw the fiddle player tuning up near the far wall, and she saw the lanterns throwing warm gold light across the faces of people who were, for one evening, trying to be their best selves. And she saw him. He sat at the end of the third long table, and the empty space around him was as plain as a river parting around a stone. People didn't sit beside him, and they didn't seem to feel bad about it either. They just naturally drifted elsewhere, the way water finds the easier path. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, with dark hair that was clean but unruly, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. He wore a plain white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his hands were folded on the table in front of him in a way that suggested he was trying very hard to look like he didn't notice the empty seats around him. But his eyes gave him away. They were looking at those folded hands with the kind of careful attention a man only gives to something when he is working very hard not to look anywhere else. Henrietta felt the shift again, stronger this time. She straightened the basket on her arm and walked toward him. She stopped at the bench beside him, just to his left, and he looked up. His eyes were dark, and they held a kind of weather in them, not storm, not quite, but the memory of storm. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two either side of it, with a faint scar along his chin and the sort of stillness that sometimes meant danger, and sometimes meant depth, and sometimes meant both. "Are you saving this seat?" Henrietta asked. He looked at her for a moment that was not quite long enough to be rude but was long enough to be honest, and then he said, "I have been." She sat down. She set her basket on the table and folded her hands much the same way he had been folding his, and she looked straight ahead at the room full of people who were now looking at her with expressions ranging from surprise to curiosity to something that might have been pity if it had not been so poorly disguised. She ignored all of it. The bread in her basket smelled good, and the fiddle was starting to play something lively, and she was hungry, and she had made her decision. "Henrietta Dalton," she said, not looking at him. "I keep the books at Gentry's store." There was a pause beside her. Then, "David Dawson. I run the Dawson homestead about 4 miles north." His voice was lower than she had expected and careful, like a man who had learned to measure his words before he spent them. "Is the homestead good land?" she asked. "It was," he said. "It's getting there again." She glanced at him then, just a quick look, and found him watching her with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not suspicion, and it was not the look men sometimes gave her that made her want to take a step back. It was more like the expression of someone who had been standing outside in the cold for a long time and had just walked into a room where there was a fire and wasn't entirely sure yet whether it was real or whether they had just started imagining warmth. "Getting there is halfway there," she said. "My father used to say that," he replied, and something in his voice shifted when he said it. Not much, just a fraction, the way a floorboard will give slightly under the right weight. "It's true whether or not your father said it," she said. He almost smiled. She could see it. The corner of his mouth moved upward approximately a quarter inch before he caught it and held it back, and she found that extremely interesting. The food began to come around, carried by the women of the community church who organized such things with military precision, and Henrietta served herself with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything. And she set a portion on David Dawson's plate too when she saw him hesitate over the serving spoon like a man who had forgotten the last time someone served him anything. He looked at the food on his plate and then looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was itself remarkable, because Henrietta had rarely found silence comfortable with anyone she had just met. The fiddle played and children ran and voices rose and fell around them, and Henrietta ate her supper and watched the room and occasionally said something small about what she saw. Nothing important, just the gentle running commentary of a person who was not afraid of the present moment. And David Dawson, beside her, listened. Not politely, not in the way people sometimes pretend to listen while waiting for their own turn to speak. He actually listened, and occasionally he said something in return, and she found that she was leaning a fraction of an inch in his direction without quite deciding to. "Everyone moved away from you," she said, because she was not the kind of woman who pretended not to notice things. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "Why?" Another pause, longer this time. "It is a long story." "The supper's not over," she said. He looked at her again with that almost smile that didn't quite make it. "It started with my father." She waited. "He was not a kind man," David said, and his voice was level in the way that voices become when someone has spent a great deal of time making peace with something that was not particularly peaceful. "He came out here in '68, bought the land, built the homestead. He was hard in ways that the territory seemed to call for and hard in ways that it didn't. He had a reputation for settling disputes with his fists before his mouth, and people held it. Even after he died 3 years ago, they still held it." "They're holding it against you," Henrietta said. "I look like him," David said simply. "I have his name, his land, his face, more or less. Some people find it hard to see the difference between a man and his father." Henrietta considered this. "Are you like him?" He turned and looked at her directly for the first time, and the dark weather in his eyes was very present. "No," he said. "I spent a great deal of my life making sure I was not." She believed him. Not because of any particular evidence beyond the way he said it, but because she had found over the years that the people who feared becoming their worst inheritance most deeply were usually the ones least likely to become it. "I came here from Missouri," she said, deciding that if he was going to be honest, she would be too. "My father died in March. The farm couldn't hold together without him, and the debts were too old to argue with. I came west because a cousin of a neighbor told my neighbor who told me that Caldwell was growing and needed people who could add and subtract." "Can you?" he asked. "Better than most," she said. "And yet you are sitting here," he said, and there was something in his voice she could not quite pin, something that might have been self-deprecating humor if it had not seemed to hurt him a little. "I sat here on purpose," she said firmly. "I am not confused about where I am sitting." He said nothing to that for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "Thank you." She nodded once and reached for her bread, and the fiddle swung into a reel, and across the room a couple stepped out to dance, and the evening turned golden and noisy around them. After the supper plates were cleared and the dancing started in earnest, David Dawson stood and said he should get back to the homestead before dark made the road difficult. He said it with a kind of practiced efficiency that told her he had been leaving places early for a long time, exiting before he was asked to. "Will you be at the church social next Saturday?" she asked, looking up at him. He looked faintly surprised, as if the question was one he had not prepared for. "I hadn't planned on it." "You should come," she said. "I make a very good apple cake and I will not have anyone to share it with." He stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, and she watched him have some kind of small internal debate with himself, the outcome of which she was not entirely sure of. "I suppose I could come," he said at last. "Good," she said. "Then it's settled." He put his hat on, nodded to her once with a formality that was oddly endearing, and walked out of the harvest hall. Henrietta watched him go, and then turned back to the room, and found that Mrs. Cordelia Pratt, who was the minister's wife and the organizing force behind approximately half of Caldwell's social events, was standing approximately 4 feet away with an expression of considerable interest. "You sat with David Dawson," Mrs. Pratt said, not quite as a question. "I did," Henrietta said. "He doesn't usually speak to anyone at these things," Mrs. Pratt said. "He spoke to me," Henrietta said pleasantly. Mrs. Pratt opened her mouth, and Henrietta could see something cautionary forming behind her eyes, some piece of advice or warning or community wisdom about the Dawson family and its difficult reputation. Henrietta gave her a smile that was warm enough to be polite and firm enough to end the conversation, and picked up her empty basket. She walked back to the boarding house in the autumn evening, under a sky that was purple at the horizon and black above and crowded with stars, and she thought about a man with dark weather in his eyes who had been saving a seat he believed no one was coming to sit in. She thought she might like to know more about that man. The church social the following Saturday came with a cold snap that turned the cottonwood trees along the creek into trembling yellow flags, and Henrietta wore her wool coat and carried her apple cake covered with a cloth, and she arrived early enough to set it on the table with the other desserts, and find a good spot to stand from which she could see the door. He came in at 3:30, and she could tell immediately that he had not wanted to come and had come anyway, which she respected. He had put effort into his appearance. His shirt was pressed, his dark hair was somewhat tamed, and he had shaved recently enough that the jaw was smooth. He stood near the door for a moment, scanning the room with the wary look of a man who had entered rooms like this many times and found them unwelcoming, and then his eyes found her and something in his posture changed, very slightly, the way a person breathes differently when they see something familiar in an unfamiliar place. She waved him over. He came. "You came," she said. "You said there was apple cake," he said. "That was a strategic choice of persuasion," she admitted. This time the smile almost made it, barely contained, hovering at the edge of his expression like a word he wasn't sure he was allowed to say. She handed him a piece of the cake and took one for herself, and they found seats at the edge of the room, not quite in the main circle of socializing but not entirely outside of it either, which felt right. They talked for 2 hours. She learned that he had been working the homestead alone since his father's death, that he had 160 acres of decent grassland and 30 of good bottomland near the creek, that he ran about 60 head of cattle and was building the herd slowly, that he had taught himself to read properly at 17 from a Bible and a seed catalog, because his father had not seen the point of schooling. He said that last part without self-consciousness, the way a person states a fact of geography, and she felt the familiar quiet anger she felt at waste, not at David, but at a world that had put obstacles between a clearly capable mind and the things it needed. She learned that he had a dog named Ranger who was mostly collie and somewhat philosopher, in that the dog seemed to spend a great deal of time sitting in the yard looking at the horizon with an expression of deep personal consideration. She laughed at that, a real laugh, not a polite one, and he looked at her when she laughed in a way she couldn't quite describe, except that it was the way people look at things they are afraid might not be real. She told him about Missouri, about her father, who had been a quiet, steady man who smelled of pipe tobacco and fresh earth, who had taught her to keep accounts because he said a woman who knew her own numbers could never be cheated, and who had loved her mother so thoroughly and completely that when her mother died of fever 12 years ago, a part of him had gone with her, and the rest had spent the next decade very slowly following. She told it plainly, without excessive grief, because she had had 6 months to make friends with the grief, and it had settled into something she could carry rather than something that was carrying her. David listened to all of it. He did not say he was sorry in the reflexive way people say it without meaning it. He said, "He sounds like a man worth having had," and she pressed her lips together for a moment because that was exactly right, and nobody had put it exactly right before. They walked back to the boarding house together when the social ended, and it was full dark by then, the stars blazing overhead with that particular Western intensity she had not grown up with. He walked on the outside of the road, the way a man does when he is trying to be proper, and there was approximately 2 feet of careful Kansas air between them, and she was very aware of it. At the gate of the boarding house he stopped and held his hat in his hands again, and she turned to face him. "Thank you for the cake," he said. "Thank you for coming," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him working up to something, and she waited with the patience she had been cultivating her whole life. "Miss Dalton," he said carefully, "I wonder if you might want to come see the homestead sometime. There is a view from the North Ridge that is, it's worth seeing." She considered him standing there in the starlight with his hat in his hands and his careful eyes and his voice that measured itself before it spoke, and she said, "I would like that very much." He exhaled just slightly, and the tension she hadn't realized he was holding loosened a fraction. "Next Sunday, then, if the weather holds." "I'll be ready at 9, she said, and went inside. She stood at the window of her room and watched him walk back down the road toward where he had tied his horse, and she was smiling before she realized she was doing it. The following Sunday the weather held, and David came for her at 9 exactly, which told her something about the kind of man he was. He had his horse, a good-looking bay gelding named Smoke, and he had brought a second horse for her, a steady gray mare called Clara who was, he explained with complete seriousness, very sensible and would not do anything unpredictable. Henrietta, who had grown up on a farm and was a more than competent rider, appreciated the thoughtfulness behind the choice even as she was quietly amused by it. She mounted without assistance, settled herself with the ease of someone who had been riding since childhood, and saw David watching her with a faint recalibration happening in his expression. "You've ridden before," he said. "I grew up on a farm," she said pleasantly. "I should have assumed," he said. "I apologize." "Don't," she said. "You were being considerate. That's not something to apologize for." They rode north through the autumn morning, through grassland that rolled and swayed in the wind like something breathing, past the low creek that ran copper in the morning light, through stands of cottonwood dropping their yellow leaves in slow spirals around the horses' feet. The sky was the color of a promise pale blue and enormous, the kind of sky that made a person feel both very small and very free at the same time, which was, Henrietta had decided, perhaps the essential quality of the West. He showed her the homestead first. It was not a grand place, but it was a real one, a solid 2-story house in whitewashed plank, a good barn, a working corral, a kitchen garden that had been cleared and turned for winter. There were improvements underway on the fence along the eastern edge, new posts set in fresh-dug earth, and the barn roof had clearly been recently reshingled on one side. She could see the care in it. The way a place looks when someone is working it not just for necessity, but for something they believe in. Ranger the dog came out of nowhere and sat down in front of her horse and looked at the horizon with the philosophical expression she had been told about, and Henrietta laughed, and David watched her laugh, and this time the smile came all the way out. It was a good smile, not a practiced or performed one, just a real one, the kind that changes a face entirely because it has been held back for so long. She could have fallen in love with him right then, over the philosophical dog and the repaired barn roof, and the smile that finally made it all the way out. She was careful enough not to. She had seen enough of the world to know that falling in love quickly was easy, and that building something lasting was different and took longer, and she intended to do the latter. But she filed the moment away with care. He took her to the North Ridge after they had walked the property, and she had asked him real questions about the land and the cattle and the fencing and the creek levels, and he had answered them with increasing ease as he realized she was actually listening and actually interested. The North Ridge was not dramatic in the way of mountains, but it was high enough to see everything. The town in the distance, a brown smudge against the grass, the silver thread of the Arkansas River running west to east in the far middle distance, the enormous sky, the grass going all the way to the horizon, moving and living and endless. They stood there for a long time without speaking, and Henrietta thought that this was one of the best silences she had ever been in. It was the kind that happened between people who did not need to fill space with sound, who could share something large and quiet together without it becoming awkward. "I came out here when I was 16, David said at last, not loudly, just into the wind. With my father, I didn't have a choice about it then. But the first time I stood up here, I thought whatever else is wrong, whatever else is hard, this is mine to look at. This is part of where I am." She looked at him, his profile against the enormous sky, the wind moving through his hair, and she said, "I understand that. Do you feel that way about Caldwell yet?" he asked. "I'm starting to," she said, and meant it. They rode back in the afternoon light, and he brought her back to the boarding house at 4, and they stood at the gate again, and this time the 2 feet of careful Kansas air between them felt like it had opinions of its own. "Miss Dalton," he said, and then stopped. "David," she said, and his name in her mouth seemed to surprise him, and she found that surprising things about him was becoming one of her quiet pleasures. "Henrietta," he said, as if trying it out, and the way he said it, carefully and with attention, as if her name was something that needed to be said correctly, made her feel things she had not felt in a long time. "Come for supper on Thursday," she said. "Mrs. Hallie, the boarding house keeper, allows it if you ask. I make a good beef stew." "You make a good many things," he said. "I do," she agreed simply. He came on Thursday, and the Thursday after that. And on the third Thursday Mrs. Hallie served them in the small sitting room and then found reasons to be in other parts of the house for the whole evening, which was her version of a blessing. The weeks turned and the weather turned with them, and November came in cold and biting, and Henrietta's work at Gentry's store grew busier as the merchants stocked for winter, and David came into town twice a week now on regular supply runs that had not quite been so regular before, and if they happened to coincide with her half-day off, well, that was the kind of coincidence that is not one. They walked, they talked, they had supper. They sat together at the second church social and the community meeting about the new school, and people noticed, and people said things, the way they always do, and Henrietta noticed the noticing and declined to give it much attention. She had come to understand that Caldwell's opinion of David Dawson was formed from old material, the sins and roughness of his father laid over him like an ill-fitting coat that others had decided was his own skin. She could see the real shape of him clearly enough, and she trusted her own vision. She knew, in the way you come to know things you have considered carefully from all angles, that she was falling in love with him. She knew it not with fireworks and panic, but with the steady growing certainty of something that has been true for a while and is finally being acknowledged. She loved the way he thought before he spoke. She loved the way he treated his land, with the care of someone who believes the earth is worth the effort. She loved that he had taught himself to read from a Bible and a seed catalog, and had gone on from there to devour every book he could find, and that there was a small shelf in his front room with perhaps a dozen books he had accumulated over years, each one clearly read multiple times. She loved that he was funny in a way that crept up on her, dry and quiet and suddenly there, and she would be laughing before she knew she was going to. She was not sure he knew any of it. He was careful with himself, David Dawson. He gave things slowly and with great thought, the way a man gives who has learned that what he gives can be thrown back in his face. She was patient. She was a woman who knew the value of patience and of letting things grow at the rate they needed to grow. November became December, and on the second Thursday of December it snowed. Not the gentle dusty snow that sometimes grazed Kansas in early winter, but a real snow, thick and purposeful, that laid itself down over everything and made the world white and silent and new-looking. David came to the boarding house for supper as usual, and after supper they stood on the front porch watching it snow, and Henrietta had her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and he stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When you sat down beside me at the harvest supper," he said, and his voice was very careful, "I almost told you to go somewhere else." She turned to look at him. "Not because I didn't want you there," he said quickly. "Because he stopped, started again. People have made up their minds about me in this town. I have understood that for a long time, and I have accepted it, I suppose. It seemed easier than fighting it. When you sat down, I thought you didn't know, and that when you found out you would move away and it would be—" He stopped again. "Worse," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "David," she said, turning to face him fully, "I knew about your father before I sat down. Mrs. Hallie told me the first week I was here. She told me about the Dawson homestead and old William Dawson and what he was like and how people felt about the family. I knew all of it before I walked into that harvest supper." He was very still beside her. "I looked at you sitting alone," she said, "and I thought that the people in that room were making a judgment based on things that had nothing to do with you, and I thought that was wrong, and I sat down." The snow came down around them, soft and steady, and she could see him processing this, reassembling some version of events he had been carrying in one shape and was now having to carry in another. "You knew," he said. "I knew," she said. He looked at her for a long time, in the snow and the cold, and then he said in a voice that had the quality of something that had been held very tightly for a long time and was just now being let go, "Henrietta." I know I have," he stopped, jaw working, and then with the effort of a man who is being braver than he has been in a long time, he said, "I have feelings for you that are not small." She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch rail. His hand was warm and large, and she felt him go very still at the touch. "That is fortunate," she said, "because mine are not small either." He turned his hand under hers and took her hand properly, and they stood in the December snow with their hands joined on the porch rail, and the white world fell around them, and Henrietta felt something lock into place inside her, solid and certain and good. He kissed her for the first time that evening, just at the gate before he left, a kiss that was careful and earnest, and said more than words about the kind of man he was. She went upstairs to her room and stood at the window and watched him ride away through the snow, and she was so warm inside that she thought she could probably have warmed the whole boarding house if you'd let her. The winter moved along the way winters do, with its own slow particular drama, with frozen roads and ice-covered troughs and the kind of cold that got into your bones and settled in for company. David came to town when the weather allowed, and when it didn't, Henrietta found that she had become the kind of person who watched the road from the window of Gentry's store and noticed the specific quality of the cold lifting or the snow easing and thought about what it meant for the road north. She visited the homestead 3 times in December, bundled in her heaviest coat, riding Clara with new confidence now that they had come to an understanding. She had brought books from the small lending shelf at the church, and David had read them with the enthusiasm of someone who has been hungry for a long time and has recently been shown where the food is kept. He had opinions about what he read, good ones, and they talked about them the way people talk when they have found someone who matches the particular frequency of their mind, which is one of the rarer pleasures available to human beings. She met his nearest neighbor on one of these visits, a man named Elias Church who had a homestead 1.5 miles to the west and who had, as far as Henrietta could gather, maintained a cautious friendship with David through the years of his father and after, the kind of friendship built on shared practical necessity and quiet respect rather than warmth, but real for all that. Elias was a lean, weathered man in his 50s with a wife named Ruth and 3 grown children, and Ruth Church looked at Henrietta with frank approval and invited her to come for dinner, which Henrietta said she would, and meant it. Christmas came, and the town of Caldwell made the best of it with a church service and a communal dinner, and the giving of small practical gifts between neighbors. David brought Henrietta a book, a real new book, purchased from the general store in Wichita on a supply run he had taken specifically to find it, a collected volume of geography essays about the Western territories that he thought she might find interesting since she was still learning the landscape of her new home. He had wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with a piece of twine, and when she unwrapped it and read the title and looked up at him, the expression on his face was the expression of someone bracing for impact without knowing whether it would be the good kind or the bad kind. It was the good kind. She had gotten him, from the limited options available, a new razor strop, which was entirely practical, and which she had had the barber's wife monogram with a small DD in the leather, which was personal and careful. And when he turned it over in his hands and saw the initials, he looked at her the way he was looking at her more and more often now, with that open, unguarded quality that she thought was probably the closest thing to watching a man trust you in real time. January arrived like a fist. The winter of 1879 in Kansas was not gentle, and the plains were no respecter of persons when they decided to demonstrate their full capacity. A blizzard came in the second week of January that lasted 3 days, and the world vanished into a white roaring wall of wind and ice that shut down the town and made travel impossible, and set Henrietta pacing the small length of her room with a worry she wasn't entirely accustomed to. Because she was generally a practical woman who did not worry about things she could not fix. But she could not fix the weather, and David was 4 miles north with 60 head of cattle and a dog with philosophical inclinations, and the storm was serious. When it broke on the 4th day, and the sun came out over a world buried in white drifts and blue shadows, she was at Gentry's store opening up when she heard a horse in the street and looked up to find David coming down from smoke with icicles on his hat brim and cold so deep in his face she could see it from across the street. She was across the street before she had quite decided to be. She took his hands in both of hers, and they were cold enough to frighten her, and she said, "How bad?" "Lost 4 head," he said, and his voice was hoarse, either from cold or from the last 3 days of managing a frightened herd in a blizzard. "Could have been worse. Barn held." "Come inside," she said. "I need to come inside first," she said. He came inside, and she made him sit by the stove at the back of the store, which Amos Gentry allowed without a word, being a decent man under the mercantile exterior, and she made coffee from the small pot kept for the store's use and brought it to him, and she stood close while he drank it, and when some of the cold blue went out of his face and some of the tension went out of his shoulders, she said, "I was worried about you." He looked at her over the coffee cup. "Were you?" "Yes," she said simply. "I thought about you too," he said. "The whole 3 days I thought, I hope she's warm. I hope the boarding house roof is sound." "It is," she said. "I know," he said, "but I thought it anyway." She reached out and brushed a remaining fleck of ice from the brim of his hat where it sat on his knee, a small gesture, practical and intimate at the same time, and he watched her do it with the expression she had come to know as his love face, though she had not said that out loud to anyone including herself until just now. February came in cold but clear, and with it came something Henrietta had not expected. A man arrived in Caldwell in the first week of February by the name of Fletcher Brand, who claimed to be a land agent representing an Eastern investment company, and who wanted to talk to anyone who owned property in the area. He was sleek and quick-talking, the kind of man who wore new clothes in a town of worn ones, and smiled at everyone as if they were all equally interesting to him, which usually meant none of them were. Henrietta noticed him because he came into Gentry's store asking questions about local landowners, who had title and who didn't, which parcels had water access, and which ones relied on wells. He asked about the Dawson homestead specifically, and the way he asked it casual and bright-eyed, and just a fraction too casual, made the back of her mind stand up straight. She mentioned it to David on Thursday. He listened without expression while she told him what Brand had asked, and then he said, "He came to the homestead yesterday." "What did he want?" "Said he was buying up land for an Eastern company that wanted to run a railroad spur through the county. Said my North Bottom land was in the proposed path. Offered me what he called a fair price." "What do you think of the price?" "I think it's less than half what the land is worth," David said, "and I think the proposition smells bad." "Did he say which company?" "He said the Meridian Land and Rail Company. I wrote it down." Henrietta thought about this. "Let me look at the county maps at the courthouse," she said, "and let me write to the land office in Topeka. I can do that through Gentry's accounts. We write to Topeka regularly on supply business." He looked at her with an expression that combined gratitude and something else, something that was about the simple radical fact of not being alone in something. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to. I'm good at this." She was. She spent 2 days quietly investigating, and what she found was this. There was no Meridian Land and Rail Company registered in Kansas, and the proposed rail route that Brand was describing did not correspond to any filed or proposed railway survey in the county records. The bottomland he was specifically asking about was, according to the county maps, located adjacent to a spring-fed tributary of the main creek, which made it the most reliably watered land in the north section of the county. Someone wanted that water access, and they were willing to lie to get it cheaply. She laid all of this out on the table at David's kitchen on Saturday afternoon, her notes spread beside a cup of coffee, and she walked him through it piece by piece, and he listened with the focused attention of a man who is very good at understanding things once they are explained clearly. "So he's a fraud," David said. "Almost certainly," she said. "He may have backers, but the company he named doesn't exist and the rail route doesn't exist. He's trying to buy the land cheap before the truth of its water value becomes widely known or before a real buyer comes along." David was quiet for a moment, looking at the notes. "What do I do?" "You go to Sheriff Tanner," she said, "and you show him this. You also file a complaint with the land office in Topeka. I'll write the letter for you if you want." "I want," he said. They went to Sheriff Tanner together that afternoon, and the sheriff, a careful, steady man named Jonas Tanner who had seen enough of the territory's peculiar species of fraud to take the matter seriously, had a conversation with Fletcher Brand that same evening. Brand left Caldwell the following morning, considerably faster than he had arrived, and that was the last anyone saw of him. What stayed after Brand left was the look Dawson gave Henrietta Dalton in the sheriff's office when Tanner told him his land was safe. Standing across the room from each other in the afternoon light coming through the dusty window, and David looked at her the way people look at things they cannot imagine losing and have just been reminded are not guaranteed. That evening, walking back from the sheriff's office in the early dark of February, he stopped on the road and she stopped too, and he turned to her, and she could see something decided in his face. "Henrietta," he said. "Yes," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out something small, and when she looked she saw it was a ring, small and silver, simple as a thought, and she understood that he had been carrying it for a while and had been waiting for the right moment, and that this, apparently, was it. "I know I am not the easiest man," he said. "I know I come with history and with a property that needs work, and with a reputation in this town that I am still working against every day. I know that I am not the obvious choice for anything." He stopped. "But I love you. I love you in a way that is clear to me, as clear as that North Ridge, and I would like very much if you would marry me." The February dark was around them, and the stars were starting, and his breath made small clouds in the cold air, and his eyes had all that weather in them, not storm, not the memory of storm, but something clearing, something moving toward open sky. And Henrietta looked at the ring in his hand, and at the man holding it, and felt the full settled weight of her certainty. "Yes," she said. "Clearly yes." He put the ring on her finger, and she pulled him by the lapel of his coat and kissed him properly, there in the middle of the road in February, with the cold and the stars and the great silence of the plains around them. And he held her with both arms, with the contained, fierce care of someone who has been given something precious and will not let it go. They were married in April, when the plains had gone green again, and the wildflowers were coming up in the short grass, and the cottonwoods along the creek had put out their first pale leaves. The ceremony was at the church in Caldwell, performed by Minister Pratt, with his wife Cordelia looking on with an expression of deep satisfaction, because she had privately considered David Dawson's isolation one of the town's outstanding injustices for several years, and had been waiting for someone with the particular combination of courage and sense required to do something about it. The church was full. Henrietta had not expected that, but as the weeks between the engagement and the wedding had gone on, something had shifted in the town's posture toward David, subtly and then less subtly. People who had been avoiding him for years found reasons to speak to him. The hardware merchant stopped the particular brand of cold efficiency he had used with David and became simply efficient. Elia's church's wife Ruth had organized a community effort to refence the south side of the homestead as a wedding gift, and a dozen men had shown up on a Saturday in March and done it. And the look on David's face when he had come out to find them, there was something Henrietta kept in a private place in her memory, where she kept the most important things. She walked down the aisle of the small church on the arm of Amos Gentry, who had offered himself for the task with the gruff kindness he brought to everything. And she wore a dress that Ruth Church had helped her sew from cream-colored cotton, with a pattern of tiny embroidered flowers at the cuffs and hem. And she carried a bouquet of early wildflowers that she had cut herself from the meadow behind the homestead that morning. David stood at the front of the church in a dark coat she had not seen before, and a white shirt and a dark tie. And when she came down the aisle, he looked at her with the expression of complete and open love that she had been watching him arrive at slowly, carefully, over months of careful arriving. And now here it was, in full, in front of everyone, unguarded and unashamed. She reached him and took his hand and turned to face the minister, and beside her she could feel David exhale slowly, the last of some long-held thing releasing, and she squeezed his hand once, and he squeezed back. They moved to the homestead in May, after the last of the spring cold, and Henrietta took over the management of the homestead's accounts with immediate and noticeable effect. She had ideas about the property, careful, practical ideas based on what she had learned about the land, and what David knew about the cattle market, and what they could figure out together about what the region needed. She thought they should expand the kitchen garden and sell the surplus to Gentry's store. She thought the south field, which was lying fallow, could be planted in winter wheat if they got the seed in time. She thought, in the longer term, that the spring-fed bottomland that Fletcher Brand had been so interested in should be developed properly. Perhaps a stock pond, perhaps irrigation to the garden, because water was the real currency of the Kansas plains, and they were sitting on more of it than they had been using. David looked at these ideas with the deep consideration he brought to everything she said, which she had come to understand was his form of respect, not quick agreement or quick dismissal, but real consideration. And then he said yes to all of them, with modifications and additions of his own that made them better, and they sat at the kitchen table with maps and pencils, and argued productively about fence lines and water tables. and Ranger sat in the doorway looking at the horizon with philosophical approval. The first summer of their marriage was a working one and a good one. The garden expanded. The winter wheat went in. The stock pond project began, with Elia's church coming over 2 Saturdays a month to help with the digging, which was the kind of help that meant something because it was given without being asked. Henrietta continued to work at Gentry's store 2 days a week, not from necessity but from choice. She liked the work, and she liked having a thread into the town's life beyond the homestead. Amos Gentry had given her a small raise after Brand's attempted fraud had been exposed, on the grounds that she had protected a local landowner from loss and that such skills were worth compensating. The summer evenings were the best part. After the work was done and the supper cleared away, they would sit on the porch in the long western light, which lasted until 9 o'clock in July and turned everything gold and then amber and then a deep, bruised rose, and they would talk or read or simply sit in the good silence that was theirs. Ranger would sit in the yard, looking at the horizon, and the cattle would move distantly in the south pasture, and the creek would run its copper and silver in the distance, and Henrietta would feel the particular quality of happiness that is not excited or loud, but is very deep-rooted, real, belonging to no single moment but present in all of them. She learned his habits and his moods and the particular grammar of his silences. She learned that, when he was troubled by something, he went to work on the fence rather than talking about it, and that after an hour of fence work he was usually ready to talk. She learned that he laughed most freely when she was being dry and factual about something absurd, and she found herself, without entirely planning to, arranging such observations more often because his laugh was one of her favorite sounds in the world. She learned that he woke early before sunrise, and went outside and stood in the yard in the dark and looked at the sky with an attention that was, she came to understand, less like habit and more like prayer. She was awake one morning in August and went out to find him standing in the yard in the dark, and she brought 2 cups of coffee and stood beside him without saying anything, looking at the same sky, and after a while he said, "When I was a boy, I used to come outside before my father woke up, just to have a moment that was mine before the day got hard. And now," she said, "now I come out because it's quiet and beautiful," he said. The reason changed. He looked at her. The reasons for a lot of things changed. She handed him his coffee and leaned into him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood in the dark watching the sky go from black to deep blue to the first burning line of dawn at the eastern edge of the world. And she thought that this was what she had come west for, not the work, which she could have found anywhere, not the landscape, which was beautiful but not hers by birth. She had come west for this, for a man who had been waiting for her at the end of a long table, with empty space around him and dark weather in his eyes, and a word for her that was true and careful and meant. September brought the second harvest supper, and this time they went together. They walked in side by side, and Henrietta felt the room shift its attention toward them in that particular way a room does when it registers something significant, and she did not mind it. They found seats, not at the end of the table but in the middle of the second row, and people sat beside them and across from them, and the empty space that had defined David Dawson's place at this table a year ago was simply gone, filled in by the natural closing of community around what it has decided to include. Mr. and Mrs. Church sat across from them, and the minister Pratt sat at the head of the table and said grace, and the fiddle started up, and the food came around, and Henrietta served her husband's plate the way she had served him that first evening, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her then, but without the astonishment now, with the settled recognition of love that knows it is returned. "A year ago," he said quietly, so only she heard, "I was sitting here alone." "I know," she said. "And now?" "And now," she agreed. They danced for the first time that evening, or tried to. David was not a natural dancer, and he knew it, and said so with a self-deprecating plainness that she found very attractive, and she was not much better, and they managed a version of the reel that was more enthusiastic than technically correct. And they both laughed, and Ruth Church laughed watching them, and even Sheriff Tanner grinned from the edge of the room. And it seemed to Henrietta that laughter was the thing that had been missing from this space for a long time and was now, loudly and a little clumsily, present. In October, she told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, plain and direct the way she did everything, and he was pouring coffee and he stopped and set the pot down and turned around and looked at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before and would never entirely be able to describe. It was somewhere between awe and terror and joy, all three at once, each one real, none of them performing. "Henrietta," he said. "I know," she said. He crossed the kitchen and held her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment, and his eyes were very full of something, and she put her hands over his. "You're not frightened?" he asked. "I'm a little frightened," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," he said with the honesty she loved him for. "But I am very—" He stopped, jaw working, and then, "I cannot say what I cannot find the word for it." "Glad," she offered. "More than that," he said. "Then just be it," she said. "You don't have to name it." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then held her with both arms for a long time, there in the kitchen in the October morning, with the coffee getting cold on the stove and Ranger scratching at the door to come in. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 passed with the particular texture of expectancy, everything slightly heightened, slightly more present, slightly more worth noticing. David became, if possible, more careful and attentive, not in a smothering way but in the way of a man who has been given something additional to love and is expanding to hold it. He finished the second upstairs room with new planking and whitewash and a small window that faced east to catch the morning light. He built a cradle from oak he had been saving, working on it in the evenings by lantern light, and the sound of the plane on the wood became part of the winter music of the house. Ruth Church came by regularly, bringing practical wisdom about the approaching birth that was a better gift than any amount of embroidered baby things. She was a plain-spoken woman who had raised 3 children and had the kind of no-nonsense comfort about such things that Henrietta found enormously reassuring, and they became genuinely close over those winter months, sitting at the kitchen table over tea while David read in the front room, talking about the practical realities of women's lives on the plains, with the freedom that comes from mutual trust. The baby arrived on the 23rd of February, 1880, in a snowstorm that was not as severe as the blizzard of the previous year, but was insistent enough to keep everyone home. And so it was David and Ruth Church, and a calm, capable local woman named Clara Marsh, who served as midwife that attended the birth. David was not in the room, it was not done, and Clara Marsh was firm about it. But Henrietta could hear him through the wall, moving back and forth the way people do when they are too agitated to sit, and she found this deeply comforting while also being vaguely amused. The baby was a boy, born in the small hours of the morning with a voice like a complaint and fists like a man who already had opinions about things. He was pink and dark-haired and perfect in the absolute way that newborn children are perfect when you have been waiting for them. And when Clara Marsh brought him to his father in the doorway, David held his son with a care that was almost too much to look at directly. The way he held him, like something both very strong and very fragile, with his big hands absolutely sure and absolutely gentle, and his face open and unguarded and shining with something that had no name but needed none. Henrietta, from the bed, tired and warm and watching, felt her whole life click into a shape she recognized as the shape it had always been moving toward. They named him Thomas. Thomas William Dawson, the Thomas for her father and the William a considered and deliberate reclamation, a way of saying that names could mean different things in different hands, that the future was not obligated to repeat the past. Thomas was, from his first weeks, a person with strong convictions about his own preferences, which his parents found exhausting and entirely endearing. He slept poorly and ate well, and had an observant quality to his gaze that David said was like looking into a small mirror, and Henrietta said was entirely from her side. And they argued about this with the comfortable affection of people who are very certain of each other. Spring came back as it always does, with its particular plains urgency, everything happening at once. The grass green overnight, the wildflowers everywhere, the cottonwoods in full voice along the creek, the cattle calving, the garden going in. Henrietta managed the garden from the yard with Thomas strapped to her front in a length of cloth, the way the older settler women had shown her. And she directed David on the placement of the winter wheat seedlings with the authority of a woman who had spent the winter planning it. And he followed her direction with the cheerful patience of a man who has learned that his wife is generally right about things she has spent time thinking about. They sold the garden surplus to Gentry's store all through that second summer, and the winter wheat came in well in the fall, and the stock pond was complete and doing exactly what Henrietta had predicted it would do for the cattle and the garden both. And by the second harvest supper of their marriage, October 1880, with Thomas 7 months old and attended to in the corner by an extremely devoted ranger, who had appointed himself the baby's personal guardian in a way that had apparently resolved all his philosophical uncertainties, the Dawson homestead was in better shape than it had been in a decade. People noticed. They always do, eventually. The merchant who had been cold began to be warm. The women who had kept their distance from David began to include him in the conversations they had on the main street, and he handled this new social inclusion with a kind of careful, genuine grace, not resentment for its lateness, just honest engagement with its presence, because he was the kind of man who understood that people were not always wrong forever, just wrong for a while. There were still some who kept their distance, who had made up their minds about the name Dawson in 1868 and saw no reason to unmake them. Henrietta accepted this with the same pragmatism she brought to other unalterable facts, like the weather and the state of the eastern pasture fence. Some things you work on and some things you note and set aside, and this was the latter. What mattered was the shape of their daily life, which was good and real and full of the small, important events that make up a life when you look back at it. The morning arguments about coffee strength, which David made strong enough to alarm a horse and Henrietta made strong enough to wake a horse, and these were apparently different things. The evenings on the porch with the great western light going its slow, spectacular way through its daily colors, with Thomas on someone's lap or on a blanket in the yard, grabbing at the grass, with the intense concentration of a person for whom grass is an extraordinary new fact. The Sundays at the church homestead, where Elias grilled beef over an open fire and Ruth made pie from the last of the summer fruit, and they all sat around the table until the sun went down talking about everything and nothing. The winter evenings with the bookshelf slowly growing, because they had made a habit of one new book per month from the catalog that came from a bookseller in Kansas City, and the discussions over those books which sometimes became debates and occasionally became arguments and always ended in understanding. The life they were building was the thing they were building it for. Not a destination, not an achievement, but the daily living of it. In the spring of 1881, Henrietta's cousin from Missouri, a young woman named Adeline Cross, wrote to say she was thinking of coming west. She was 22, newly widowed after only a year of marriage, her husband taken by a fever that moved through the Missouri bottoms that winter, and she had nothing holding her to Missouri and something pulling her toward open space. Henrietta wrote back immediately saying come, and come she did in late April, thin and quiet with the particular quietness of recent grief, arriving on the stage with a single trunk and an expression of someone who has decided that moving forward is the only direction remaining. She stayed at the boarding house at first, and then Henrietta convinced her to come to the homestead, where the house had more room than they were currently filling, and where Adeline's help with Thomas and the garden would be welcome, and her company more so. Adeline had a gift for things growing, not just in the garden but in a larger sense, the way some people make things around them want to be alive, and she threw herself into the work of the homestead with a focused energy that Henrietta recognized as the way people keep themselves going when the alternative is to stop. The summer of 1881 was generous, and the homestead flourished with it. They built a second garden section for vegetables to preserve for winter, and Adeline ran it with quiet expertise, and the harvest from it was enough to sell a significant portion to gentries and put up enough preserved stores to carry them to the following spring with comfort. David expanded the herd to nearly 100 head with a careful purchase from a ranch that was breaking up south of Wichita, negotiated with a hard-eyed practicality that got him 20 more head than the asking price suggested he should have, because Henrietta had written out the arguments in advance, and he had walked into the negotiation knowing exactly what the land could support and exactly what the math said. Thomas walked at 11 months, an event that inspired genuine celebration at the homestead and at the church farm both, and proceeded to apply himself to the project of reaching every surface at standing height with the thoroughness of a small person who has recently discovered capability and finds it intoxicating. Ranger followed him at a constant 3 feet, the philosophical distance having been replaced by the practical distance of a dog who has accepted responsibility for a small and unpredictable creature. On the evening of the second anniversary of their marriage, April 1882, they sat on the porch after Thomas was asleep and Adeline had retired to her room, and the stars were out in their full western extravagance, and the creek ran its distant silver voice, and David reached over and took Henrietta's hand in the dark. 2 years, he said. 2 years, she agreed. Do you know what I think about sometimes, he said. Tell me, she said. I think about that evening at the harvest supper, he said. Before you sat down, I had been sitting there for an hour, watching everyone settle anywhere but beside me, and he paused. I was so accustomed to it that I had almost stopped noticing it. Almost, and then I saw you come in. She was quiet, listening. I thought, there's a woman who hasn't made up her mind about anything yet, he said. She's new here, she doesn't know, and I thought when she finds out she'll move away like the rest. And I thought maybe I should just get up and leave before she sat down because it would be easier to have no one than to have someone and then lose them. But you didn't get up, she said. No, he said, I didn't. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. Because I was saving the seat, he said. I know it's a strange way to put it. But I think some part of me, the part I couldn't quite silence, believed that the seat was being kept for someone. That somewhere in the logic of things, there was going to be a person who came and sat in it. I had been waiting for that without quite knowing I was waiting. And then you came in and you looked at the room and your eyes came to me and you walked over and you asked if I was saving the seat. And you said you had been, she said. And I had been, he said. She turned to look at him in the dark, and he was looking at the stars, and his profile was familiar to her now in every light: morning, lantern light, winter blue, summer gold, and this, starlight and darkness, and she knew it as well as she knew her own hands, which were herself. I'm glad I sat down, she said. He turned from the stars and looked at her. So am I, he said, every day. She moved closer to him on the bench, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the May dark under the blazing western sky. And somewhere in the house Thomas was asleep in his oak cradle with Ranger on the floor beside him. And somewhere in the east Adeline was finding her way back from grief toward something that was hers. And the homestead was sound, and the cattle were well, and the creek ran on. And Henrietta Dalton Dawson felt the full weight of her life resting in her hands like something she had built with care from nothing but her own willingness to sit down. In the late summer of 1882, Adeline met a man named Martin Hollies at the church social, a farmer from 8 miles east who had come to Caldwell on business and stayed to hear the music. He was a gentle-natured, direct man of 28 who had a homestead and a fair hand with horses and no particular social graces, but an honest face. And Adeline looked at him with the eyes of someone who has been away from warmth for long enough to recognize it when it comes back. Henrietta watched this from across the room with the clear-eyed attention she brought to everything, and she thought of sitting down at the end of a table because someone should, and she said nothing and let it happen. Martin Hollis came calling at the Dawson homestead 3 times in September, and each time he came, he was a little less nervous and a little more real, and Adeline was a little more herself, and a little less the woman who had arrived in April with nothing but grief and a single trunk. By November they were engaged, and the town of Caldwell, which had been paying attention, received this information with the satisfaction of people who enjoy seeing things go right. Adeline was married in January of 1883 in the same church where David and Henrietta had been married, in a small simple ceremony with Henrietta standing beside her, and David standing beside Martin, and Thomas standing in the front pew with Ruth Church, who had agreed to manage him during the ceremony, and was discovering that managing Thomas Dawson was a project that required both arms and full attention. After Adeline moved to the Hollis homestead, the Dawson house had more quiet, and Henrietta found she welcomed it differently now than she would have 2 years before. She had the quiet and she had the company, and she knew the difference, which was everything. In March of 1883, she found out she was expecting again. She told David the same way she had told him the first time, plain, in the kitchen, in the morning, and his response was the same in essence but different in texture. He was less terrified this time and more purely glad, and the fear that had been in the awe before was smaller, because he had done this once and he knew the shape of it, and he trusted her strength in it, which he had not quite been able to fully trust the first time because he hadn't seen it yet. The second baby came in October of that year, during Harvest Week, which Henrietta found entirely appropriate. She was born on a clear Tuesday evening when the plains were gold with the turning grass, and the sky was the particular transparent blue of high autumn, and she came into the world with less complaint than her brother and more immediate curiosity, looking around the room from her first minutes with the dark eyes she had gotten from her father, and the expression of calm assessment she had gotten from her mother. They named her Eleanor, and from the beginning Eleanor Dawson had the quality of someone who had arrived with a plan. Thomas was 3½ and considered his sister with the focused suspicion of a child who has been the sole object of all available attention and is now reassessing the landscape. Within 2 weeks he had decided she was interesting, and within a month he had appointed himself her secondary guardian alongside Ranger, who accepted this arrangement with his customary philosophical dignity. David held his daughter the same way he had held his son, with absolute care and absolute sureness, but his face was different. With Thomas there had been the awe and the terror. With Eleanor there was a kind of peaceful recognition, as if he had known her before she arrived and was simply confirming the fact of her. "She looks like you," he said to Henrietta. "She looks like herself," Henrietta said. "Yes," he said, smiling. "She does, very much so." The years moved the way good years do, not slowly, not fast, but with the full weight of their own content, dense and real and worth the living. The homestead grew, carefully and steadily, the way things grow when they are tended by people who understand both patience and purpose. The herd expanded and the garden flourished, and the stock pond did exactly what Henrietta had said it would do. The winter wheat became a reliable part of their income, and eventually they added a second crop section in the south field, and the Dawson homestead was known in Caldwell not as the place of old William Dawson's difficult legacy, but as one of the better-run properties in the county. David became, gradually, a man that people in Caldwell sought out for advice, first about cattle, then about fencing and water management, then more broadly about land decisions, because his thinking was clear and his honesty was evident, and he had no interest in telling anyone what they wanted to hear rather than what the situation required. He served on the County Agricultural Committee for 2 terms beginning in 1884, and he was not comfortable in the role and said so, but he did it because Henrietta said it mattered, and he trusted her judgment about what mattered. She continued at Gentry's store until 1885, when Amos Gentry retired and sold the business to his nephew. And by then, the homestead's accounts were sufficient that she directed her considerable organizational intelligence entirely at their own operation, with results that the books made abundantly clear. She was not the kind of woman who needed external acknowledgement of her capabilities, but she received it anyway, because excellence is difficult to ignore in sustained proximity. Thomas started school in Caldwell in the fall of 1885, walking or riding the 4 miles with a cheerful persistence that reflected both parents. He was a good student and a social one, the kind of child who arrives in a room and immediately seems to have been there always, and Henrietta watched this with the particular feeling she had when she saw something in her children that surprised her, something that had arrived through the mystery of combination and circumstance, and was entirely its own. Elinor at 2 was already somebody solemn and observant and prone to appearing suddenly at one's elbow and stating a fact one had not realized she had noticed. She learned to talk with a precision that her father recognized and her mother smiled at. She had opinions about the garden, about which she was largely correct, and opinions about Ranger, about whom she was completely correct, and opinions about the relative merits of various stories read at bedtime, which she communicated with a critical clarity that left her parents consistently amused and occasionally chastened. The fall of 1885 brought a gathering at the church farm. Elias and Ruth had their eldest son married off that October, a celebration that pulled in half the county, and the Dawsons and the Hollises and a dozen other families all crowded into the churchyard under a sky that was doing its autumn best, all blue and gold, and faintly smoky with the burning of stubble fields in the distance. Adeline came with Martin and their own 2 children now, a boy of 2 named Henry and a girl of 4 months named Claire, and she was a different person than she had been when she arrived in Caldwell, fuller, more settled, present in her own life in a way that grief had temporarily moved her out of, now moved back. She and Henrietta stood together at the edge of the celebration watching their families mix in the October afternoon, and Adeline said, "Do you know what I thought when I first arrived here?" "Tell me," Henrietta said. "I thought I was coming to survive," Adeline said. "I thought that was the best I could do, just get through things." "And now," Henrietta said. Adeline looked out at the yard, at Martin with Henry on his shoulders, at Claire in Ruth Church's arms, at the enormous sky and the gold grass and the very real and particular beauty of the afternoon. "Now I'm not surviving," she said. "I'm just living it." "That's the whole thing," Henrietta said. The winter of 1885 was mild, and the spring of 1886 came early and generous. Elinor walked at 10 months in an event that Thomas considered a personal achievement on the grounds of having shown her how, and the dog Ranger, now getting old and gray around the muzzle but still steady and present in the yard, acknowledged this development with the dignity appropriate to his role. Ranger died in the summer of 1886, in the yard in the morning, lying in the sun in his usual spot, facing the horizon he had been considering for 11 years. Thomas cried, and Elinor did not cry but was very serious and quiet for several days, and David buried him at the edge of the yard near the fence post where he used to sit, and he stood over the grave for a long time with his hat in his hands in that way he had, and Henrietta stood beside him and did not say anything because there was nothing to say. A few weeks later, a neighbor whose dog had a litter brought over a pup, small and brown and uncertain, and Elinor sat on the kitchen floor and looked at it for a long time and said, "He is not Ranger." Then she picked him up and he licked her face and she said, "He will have to do," with the pragmatic acceptance of a person who understands that the world keeps going and that this is not a betrayal of anything that came before. They named him Scout, and he grew fast and energetic and was terrible in the garden for the first year, and then was corrected by Elinor at the age of 3 in a manner so clear and authoritative that the dog behaved from then on with attentive good sense. David watched this and said to Henrietta with very great pride barely contained behind his usual reserve, "She has your exact face when she means something." "She has your stubbornness," Henrietta replied. "Our stubbornness," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "our stubbornness." In the summer of 1887, with Thomas 12 and Eleanor 4, Henrietta and David rode to the North Ridge together on a Sunday afternoon, the way they had done many times over the years, and they stood in the summer wind with the grass moving in long waves below them and the sky enormous overhead. And Caldwell was a brown and silver smudge in the south, and the Arkansas River was a bright thread, and the land was every shade of gold and green that summer made in Kansas. "I want to tell you something," David said, which was how he had told her he loved her in February in the snow, and she turned to look at him. He was looking at the land, at their land, at the particular familiar spread of it, and his face had the quality of a man surveying a life well lived and finding it good. "When I came to that harvest supper," he said, "I had been telling myself for years that this was enough, this land, this work alone, that it was enough to run the place and do the work and not need more. That wanting more was just asking to be heard again." The wind moved through the grass below them. "And then you sat down," he said. "And you had been saving the seat," she said. "I had been," he said. He looked at her. "I didn't know it then, I know it now. Some part of me was holding space for something I didn't let myself believe in. And then you showed up and were exactly everything." She looked at him in the summer wind, this man she knew in every light and every season, this man who had taught himself to read from a Bible and a seed catalog and had become someone, this man whose love had the quality of bedrock, not dramatic, not combustible but deep and steady and there, always there, the thing you stand on when everything else shifts. "David," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you in a way that I do not have adequate words for," she said. "I love you with the specific vocabulary of everything that has happened since I sat down at that table, every morning since, every hard winter and good harvest and crying baby and philosophical dog. I love you with all of it." He took her hand and held it, and they stood on the North Ridge with the whole enormous Kansas sky above them and the land spreading in every direction. And it was all theirs, not in the sense of possession, but in the sense of belonging, the sense that this was where they were from, both of them, the place they had arrived at, and the place that had made them who they were going to be. Thomas and Eleanor grew with the years, the way children grow when they are given good soil, steadily, with character, becoming themselves in ways that were both surprising and entirely logical. Thomas had his father's quiet strength and his mother's practical intelligence, and he also had something neither of them had quite, a natural ease with people, an openness that made him the kind of young man others wanted to be near. And watching it, Henrietta thought sometimes that the thing that had been hardest about David's life, the isolation, the keeping of distance, had been undone in their son, who wore his openness like a shirt he'd been born in. Eleanor was something entirely her own. She read everything she could get her hands on and had strong opinions about all of it. She helped with the accounts by the time she was 9 with a precision that made Henrietta both proud and slightly competitive, because Eleanor had a way with figures that went beyond adding and subtracting into a kind of intuitive understanding of what numbers meant that Henrietta found extraordinary and David found entirely unsurprising. In 1888, Amos Gentry's nephew offered David the opportunity to buy out a share of the dry goods store, which he and Henrietta discussed at length over several evenings, and ultimately declined on the grounds that their interest and competence was in the land, and that a partial share in a business they were not going to run fully was more liability than asset. The nephew understood, or pretended to, and the friendship with the Gentry establishment, now in its new management, continued. The late 1880s brought changes to Caldwell, and to Kansas broadly as the cattle trade shifted, and the railroad drew new routes and new settlements appeared and old ones consolidated. David watched these changes with the careful attention of someone whose livelihood depended on understanding the landscape, and Henrietta watched them with her accountant's eye for what they meant in numbers. Together, they made several adjustments to the operation, reducing the cattle herd and increasing the grain acreage as the grain market opened, investing in a small amount of improved farming equipment that paid for itself within 2 seasons, and beginning to sell directly to buyers in Wichita rather than through the intermediary that had been eating margin for years. By 1890, the Dawson homestead was one of the most productive mid-size operations in that part of Kansas, not by accident, but by 12 years of deliberate good thinking applied steadily to real problems. David did not talk about this in the way some men would. He accepted the results with the quiet satisfaction of someone who believes that work speaks louder than talk, which was a conviction Henrietta shared entirely. The town of Caldwell continued its own evolution, growing and changing with the territory's changes, the cattle trail era giving way to the farming era, the rough edges of the early West softening here and there, without disappearing entirely. Henrietta watched all of it with the eyes of a woman who had come here at 24 with nothing but her own capability and a willingness to sit down in difficult places, and who had stayed and become part of the fabric of the thing. She was on the school board for 3 years beginning in 1889, a role she took because Eleanor was school age, and the school needed better organization, and she was the person in the room who could provide it. She reorganized the curriculum purchasing, got the school a proper set of reference books for the first time in its history, and argued successfully for a second teacher when the enrollment outgrew one, and then resigned when she felt the work was done and someone else could carry it, because she had no interest in positions for their own sake. Thomas finished school in 1891 and came back to the homestead to work it, which was what he had always planned to do and what the homestead needed. He had his father's understanding of land and cattle, and added to it a head for the new machinery that was coming into farming use in those years. And father and son worked the land together with a practical complementarity that Henrietta watched with a fullness she could not fully contain. Eleanor, at 8, was already planning to go to the teacher's college in Emporia when she was old enough, a decision she had made at 6 and mentioned with the regularity of someone who considers the matter settled and is simply keeping everyone informed. In the spring of 1891, on the evening before the 13th anniversary of their first meeting at the harvest supper, David and Henrietta sat on the porch in the April evening, which was warm for the season, with the smell of the spring earth and the sound of the creek and the distant comfortable sounds of the cattle in the pasture. Thomas was in the barn. Eleanor was inside, asleep or reading. It was sometimes hard to tell. Scout was in the yard, looking at the horizon with an expression that had recently taken on philosophical dimensions that reminded everyone of Ranger, and this they had decided was a form of tribute. 13 years, David said. 13 years, Henrietta said. He reached over and took her hand, the same gesture as 100 other evenings, and she took his in return, the same response as 100 other evenings, and it was not the same at all. It was 13 years of the same gesture, which is not repetition but accumulation, which is not the absence of meaning but its full presence. "I want to tell you something," he said, for the 3rd time in 13 years with that same opening, and she turned to him with the same willingness she had turned with every time. "Tell me," she said. "You were the bravest thing," he said quietly, into the spring evening. Sitting down beside someone the whole room had decided wasn't worth sitting beside. Not because you didn't know, you knew, you sat down anyway. "You had been saving the seat," she said. "I had," he said, "but I wouldn't have held it much longer. I was about to give up on it." She looked at him in the spring light, this man, her man, with his dark hair going to gray at the temples now, and the familiar weather of his eyes, cleared and present, and the scar along his jaw and the good hands, and the particular set of his shoulders that she could identify from across any field at any distance because it was the shape of someone she loved. "I'm glad I was on time then," she said. He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed it, an old gesture between them, formal and tender, and she leaned her head on his shoulder the way she had learned to lean, exactly at the angle where the weight of the day fell away, and the weight of everything good remained. The spring evening settled into dark around them, slow and warm, with the first stars appearing above the roof of the house they had built their life in, and the creek running its silver voice in the distance. And somewhere in the barn Thomas was working late with a lantern, and Alina was almost certainly still awake reading something she would report on at breakfast with great authority, and the grass moved in the light wind with the living patience of the plains. And the world was very large and very beautiful and very full of the things they had chosen, and the things that had chosen them. Henrietta Dalton Dawson was 41 years old, and had come west with nothing but herself, and had made of it everything she needed. She had found a man at the end of a table who had been waiting for someone to sit beside him, and she had been that person, and it had been the truest thing she had ever done, and the best, and she thought she would sit beside him at every table for the rest of her life, at every supper and every ordinary morning and every difficult winter and every good harvest and every quiet evening on this porch with this sky, and she would never stop being glad that she had sat down. She would never stop being glad that he had been saving the seat. And David Dawson, with his wife's head on his shoulder and his hand holding hers, with his son in the barn and his daughter in the house, and his land stretching in every direction and his life full and real and his, thought about a boy who had come outside in the dark before sunrise just to have a moment that belonged to him before the day turned hard, and understood that every day since Henrietta sat down beside him had been a day that belonged to him, fully and freely, with no darkness preceding it and no hardness to brace for, just his wife and his children and his land and his life, which was everything and which was enough, which was more than enough, which was the whole thing.